It was an amazing time. The paper was coining money. The publisher who owned the thing pumped all this money back into it. If I could come up with 2 or 3 reasonable ideas, say in South Africa or Germany, they'd send me off there. Go and have a look and come back when you've got them. No rush.
Ladies and gentlemen, beloved of America!
I had friends who would literally go to a celeb's house and gather up the garbage on garbage day before the truck got there, take it off and go through it. And it actually became a staple of American journalism. They'd analyze garbage of the famous and see what they really were doing. We found people, some of these celebs were, they're getting the Inquirer every week, because we found it in the garbage. They were reading it.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Banal of America Audio, with your host, Tim Banal.
What is going on, my friends? This is Tim Banal of banalofamerica.com with another edition of BoA Audio Season 6. Before we dive into this installment of the program, first allow me to thank the man who provided the theme music for this week's edition of the program, talking about our good buddy Pete Diggins. You can find out more from him at the website www.aurophonic.com, and you spell that AUROPHONIC.com. And if you're a BoA Audio listener out there who wants to contribute music to future installments of the program, simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com, and I'd be happy to give your tunes a listen. Now let's get down to business on this installment of BoA Audio, and it is a barn burner, my friends. We are going behind the scenes at the National Enquirer with Paul Bannister, author of Tabloid Man and the Baffling Chair of Death. Paul Bannister was formerly the National Enquirer's chief paranormal reporter in the 1970s and 80s, during its glory years when it really was part of the national consciousness. Paul Bannister was right in the thick of it. He's going to pull back the curtain on the notorious tabloid, revealing the amazing amount of money the paper spent on hunting down stories, the bizarre eccentricities of its owner, George Pope, and the unique editorial style behind the Enquirer's famous articles. Along the way, we're going to hear a whole bunch of great stories from Paul Bannister, including his run-in with Sally Field, his investigations into psychometry and remote viewing. We're going to hear an EVP that he inadvertently captured during a phone interview, and tons more captivating tales. Plus, we'll reflect on the evolution and downfall of the tabloid industry as the mainstream media has become more and more like the Enquirer of old. Altogether, it truly is a fascinating, revelatory, and rare glimpse at a long-lost era in journalism with Paul Bannister, a man who was in the trenches and on the road, uncovering a world of amazing stories for the National Enquirer. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Paul Bannister, allow me to provide you with a little background on him. Englishman Paul Bannister was a national newspaper reporter in Britain, where he worked for the Daily Mail, the Sun, and the BBC, among others. He was recruited by the National Enquirer, where he became the senior reporter and the tabloid's top specialist in Tales of the Psychic, a post that took him to about 40 countries to interview all kinds of people, from a spirit healer in Iceland to a witch doctor in Brazil. On assignment, Bannister has been menaced by a ghost, shot at by a gunman, endangered by Michael Jackson, booted by Gidget, spat on by a kangaroo, and threatened by a horde that includes actor Tony Curtis, footballer George Best, the French police, the Salvadorian military, comedian Bob Hope's daughter, actress Stephanie Power's brother, the murdered John Benet Ramsey's neighbors, a New Jersey mob hitman, Princess Caroline's bodyguards, and a weedy, bespectacled, middle-aged public librarian, plus many others. He has uncovered exclusive tales of the famous that include Oprah's death video, Obama's bikini girl scandal, and the baby Joni Mitchell kept secret even from her parents. He has shared a sardine with Prince Charles, a scotch with Jean Dixon, a prayer with Dog the Bounty Hunter, a grooming with a talking gorilla, and a trade secret with Engelbert Humperdinck. All of this came about because of an old chair that legend said killed the people who sat in it. The book we'll be discussing here on the program, of course, is Tabloid Man and the Baffling Chair of Death, and you can find out more about the book and info on Paul Bannister at the website www.bannisterbooks.com, and you spell that BANNISTER books.com. Links available all over Banal of America, of course. Be sure to check it out. And with all that said, folks, let's get down to business and rock and roll. This interview was recorded on June 7th, 2011. Paul Bannister takes us behind the scenes at the National Enquirer and the tabloid newspaper industry on BoA Audio, Season 6. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of BoA Audio, Season 6. This time around on the program, we're kind of like really going into what I think is my wheelhouse here of the paranormal, really, and that's the people behind the paranormal, the people who investigate this and the people who research this and the people who have looked at it. And also, sort of on a sociological level, we're going to tackle a whole bunch of issues here. I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm probably going to babble like a maniac here because I just read this book today and I absolutely loved it, and I've been looking forward all evening to this conversation. Our guest is Paul Bannister. He's the author of Tabloid Man and the Baffling Chair of Death, and that is a memoir from him that talks about his life as a writer for the National Enquirer and a whole bunch of the tabloid newspapers, and it is an amazing book. I cannot put this one over enough, folks. This one you have to go out and pick up because I enjoyed it tremendously, and I just know the BoA Audio listeners are going to love this book, and hopefully we can do justice to this fantastic book in this conversation here with Paul Bannister. Loved the book. It details his life as a reporter for the National Enquirer and the tabloid newspapers. This guy has lived a life of, 5 to 10 people, just the sheer travel alone. He's been to all 50 states, he's been to 40 countries, and he's investigated all these strange and unusual stories, as well as a whole host of celebrity stories for these tabloid newspapers. Plus, the book Tabloid Man offers an invaluable look behind the scenes at what it was like writing for the tabloids back in the 70s and 80s. So it is a real thrill for me to have him on the program. Paul, welcome to BoA Audio. I'm looking forward to this.
Wow, with that introduction, Tim, I'm pink and wriggling with embarrassment. I hope we can live up to it, that's all. I'm very grateful to be on the show. It's a powerhouse among podcasts, I know that. And yeah, there's a lot of ground to cover, isn't there? We've certainly got that to do. A lot of stuff to offload.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, like I said, you've lived a life of 5 to 10 men yourself. Just the travels and the stories, and it's amazing. I just can't put this book over enough. I was captivated by it and just loved reading it, and the insights are just tremendous. Now, we usually start the interviews out here with the bio, the background. Of course, the book is a memoir of your travels and work here for the tabloid newspapers. But give us a little bit of a thumbnail bio. Who is Paul Bannister?
Yeah.
How did you end up in these situations, that ended up becoming Tabloid Man?
Okay, well, just as a reference, for anybody who actually wants to see the picture and have a laugh, there's a website called bannisterbooks.com, so they can actually sample some bits of the book and get some other. I'll probably forget lots of important things, so if they wanted to go to that, they can take a quick look and see themselves. Anyway, the long short story is that I was working in the UK. I was working for a national newspaper, the Daily Mail, and I was recruited to the Enquirer. And that came about in an odd sort of way. A friend of mine wandered in the middle of a gloomy winter's day in the north of England in a white suit. He looked like he just escaped from a Busby Berkeley musical. White suit, tan, brothel sneakers, brothel creepers on his feet. I said, good God, Harry, what's with you? He said, I'm working for this outfit in Florida. He said, you drive to work under the palm trees, unlimited expenses, and he said, send me some story ideas. Become a stringer. I didn't even know what a stringer was. Anyway, so I sent some ideas, and one of the things I came across was a story from a pub in Yorkshire. And the pub is called the Busby Stoops. It's a very old place, of a very old area. The Romans settled the area, of course. And the story was that anybody who sat in this particular chair in the pub would die within 3 days. That was a local legend. So I went up there, investigated it, and I didn't investigate it in any great depth, I have to say. I went up there and I reported it. And I sent the story back to the Inquirer. And eventually it became their page one lead, and the headline was The Baffling Chair of Death, which, of course, is where I got my book title. Mm-hmm. So because of that, I got recruited. I moved to Florida for a couple of years, and that was 40 years ago, I think. Something like that. It seems like 40 years anyway. And in the 70s. And was there right at the hinge of tabloid history. It was an amazing time. The paper was coining money. The publisher who owned the thing pumped all this money back into it. If I could come up with 2 or 3 reasonable ideas, say in South Africa or Germany, they'd send me off there. Go and have a look. And come back when you've got them. No rush. So I got to, as I say, travel to about 40 countries around the world, from Iceland to Brazil. I got to deal with some serious stories like the CIA training psychic spies in California, or at the other end of the scale, I actually wrote a book for Gene Dixon, who was as fake a psychic as you'll come across in a long day's march. So I had this wonderful time on travel the world on other people's money, and for 7 years I was the chief reporter of the paranormal. And it was just happenstance, Tim. I just fell into it because I'd done that one story about the baffling chair of death. And when they needed to do more psychic stories, they did this.
I don't even really know where to begin on this, because the book is so rich with not just stories that you covered, but also like these behind-the-scenes stories. Let's talk about Gene Pope and the National Enquirer.
Right, okay. Well, why don't I give you a thumbnail on the way things worked in the 70s? I want to make one fairly clear distinction. The tabloids today are nothing like the tabloids of the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
After Pope died in whatever it was, 87 or 88, I think it was, they became celebrity rags. Frankly, they're all they're concerned with. But back in Pope's day, Gene Pope, we'll go back to right to the beginning. Gene Pope was the son of a mafia-linked quarry owner in New Jersey, a millionaire quarry owner. Gene, who boasted that his godfather was Frank Costello of the Bonanno family, the godfather of the Bonanno family. Gene Pope bought the New York Enquirer, and he found a good formula for it. It was actually selling in New Jersey mostly, but he realized that people would gather around at the scene of a traffic accident. They loved the blood and gore, so he started finding stories, traffic accident stories, photographs of horrible mutilations and things. And he ran the paper up to about 1 million circulation. I mean, he had headlines there like, "I use my dead baby's face as an ashtray." I mean, and as I say, it ran up to about 1 million. Well, Pope got into some difficulties with the Teamsters Union. It was possibly mob-related, and he opted to move out of New Jersey and go down to Florida. And that would be in 71. And he started the paper there as the National Enquirer. Well, he couldn't run these gory stories because one of his genius moves was to put the paper where we know it is today, on the supermarket checkout rack.
Yeah.
You don't notice that you're paying, money for it there, and everybody goes to the supermarket. They've got to get the groceries. It was a brilliant, brilliant move. So anyway, he couldn't run the gore stories, so he decided to model the paper on the Reader's Digest. And the Enquirer had about 70 categories of stories. I mean, it would be celebrity, occult, and the occult would be predictions and research into it, and ghosts, and He had UFOs as a whole separate category. How to be this, more creative, how to be a better listener, how to choose a pet, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
He had help stories, thrift and medical breakthroughs and government waste and reader polls. A whole spectrum of these things. We actually had a library of stories by category. And it was a real-on formula, that the writers would go to. We'd have, okay, this week we're going to have 3 occult stories, 4 how-tos, 2 something else's, and they would go into this inventory rooms and pick out the files and then plug those into the paper for the week. The whole system was run in a way that was unbelievable. It was run in an adversarial way. Pope broke the whole staff down into teams.
Yeah.
An articles editor, a handful of reporters, and a common pool of photographers. Very few photographers, by the way, just a few. Mm-hmm. About 80 reporters and about a dozen editors. But they competed. And every so often they'd send 2 editors off to the same city. Say, off you go to Boston for a week. And the one who comes back with the most stories keeps his job. Friday afternoons, it was very common in the Inquirer. You go down the corridor there, and there'd be about 4 o'clock, there'd be a little group of weeping girls, because some of their friends had just been fired, or a whole department of 25 people went once at an hour's notice.
That was some of the amazing stuff, too. This guy, Gene Pope, sounded like such a character. One story that was in the book here that I thought was just stunning was how when they moved from New York to Florida.
Oh, yeah.
A bunch of the staff, I'll just set you up here. He surprised some of the staff when they arrived at the train station.
He did indeed. Well, yeah, everybody was told to show up to, let me see, would it be Penn Station or Grand Union? I can't remember. They were told, the whole staff, and the staff wasn't that big at that stage, maybe 40, 50 people. And they, okay, come down to the station. People sold their houses, or they ended their leases. They were going to move to Florida. They showed up to the station, and about a third of them weren't going. He didn't get round to telling anybody. He just had his, one of his one of his tame executioners, I suppose. No, there's no tickets for you. And these people were just left there. They'd got their goods packed. They're in moving trucks, perhaps even on the way. He was cold, very, very cold, absolutely ruthless, heartless. I mean, he fired one assistant I knew. He got a memo, and there's a spelling error in it. And Pope saw it, and he saw the spelling, and he just said, "Fire the dummy." That was the guy gone. I had an email just the other week from a former colleague there, and she said she'd wandered into the coffee-making room for the staff, and by chance, and unusually, Pope was in there. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Pope, I didn't know you made your own coffee." And then she went, "Oh, drat, I've just ended my career here." And that afternoon, she rushed to see the new phone list to see if she was still on it, because that was the way she knew she would still be working next week.
Oh, my God. Yeah, it sounds like there was always this, I think you said in the book, like this hatchet hanging over everybody all the time, because this guy would just fire you on a whim.
Absolutely, yeah. A security guy said to him, "Good evening, Mr. Pope, how are you doing?" And he'd been warned not to talk to the boss. And he got fired. And the personnel director said to him, the good evening, Mr. Pope was okay. He said, it was the how are you doing got you fired.
My goodness.
Yeah, so that was the man. I mean, we basically, and he didn't look like anything. He wandered around in these Sears clothes. He looked like the janitor. He was always adjusting the thermostats in the office. And he's come out of his office, which of course had bulletproof glass in the windows, and he had his security guys check under the car with mirrors before he left home or before he left the office. He was well aware of his mafia connections. I often suspected, as did other people, that we were actually a laundry for illegal money, because we could spend anything, Tim. And now when I think back on it, I think, my goodness, why didn't we see that? I've had $800 dinners, and the company never raised an eyebrow. I mean, not me personally. I'm not that much of a pig, but I'd be out entertaining somebody. I go out with some professor or some researcher, or whoever it was, somebody important to the story, 2 or 3 people perhaps. $800, and if I had a receipt, it was reimbursed. If I didn't have a receipt, it wasn't reimbursed. It was as easy as that.
Yeah. Reading the book and hearing these stories about the money that was spent, my jaw was just like hitting the floor. I think he said at one point, one of the guys you work with, like only ordered on the right side of the menu or something like that. Yes,
Black Bob. Yeah, Black Bob Smith. Yeah, that's true. When I first went there, I went on, as was typical, I went on about a month's tryout. I actually was there for 6 weeks on tryout to see if they like me, if I like them. And we were given, we were accommodated, just, Holiday Inn type place on the beach, just near the office. The office is in Lantana, on a beach town in Florida. And we were given an allowance for, we could charge our breakfast and we could charge our dinners, and we were given sort of free reign in the bar. Of course, one guy spoiled it after I'd been there 2 or 3 weeks, and he spoiled it. He was ordering half a dozen bottles of champagne and not drinking them in the bar, taking some with him. And so eventually, the accountant said, "Well, no, you're limited, guys. $20 or $30, for drinks is all right, but we're not paying $450,
Right. And this is back in the 70s when $30 or $40 was a lot more money than it is now.
And we were massively well paid. I mean, one of our rewrite girls, she'd come from the Palm Beach Post. She was a good friend of mine, tennis partner of mine, and all this. Was probably the highest paid journalist in America at the time.
Wow.
I don't know exactly what she was on, but around 150, 180,000.
Oh my God.
When a reporter on a big paper like the Trib, Chicago Trib or the New York Times, would be on maybe $15,000 to $18,000. She's on about 10 times that. Yeah.
Well, that's what I found so interesting too about the Inquirer, and from reading your book, it was like this was like a massive juggernaut of money that was spent and staff. Like you said, 80 people there, 80 reporters. I mean, that had to be bigger, if not as big as all the major newspapers and the money spent on these guys and everything. I mean, it's stunning how massive this was.
Immense. It was an immense money-making operation for stuff. They're selling 5 million copies a week.
Wow.
I mean, now all the tabloids together sell maybe 2 million, all of them together. Probably not even 2 million. It's probably 1.5. And, the Inquirer, the biggest issue the Inquirer had was Elvis Presley's death, and they sold 7.2 million that week. So, and they had no outlay apart from operating expenses. When Pope died, it turned out he'd been taking about 6 million a year out of the paper for his own self. He lived very modestly. He didn't travel. He had a nice oceanfront house, but he drove a new Caprice every year, and he drove about 3 miles to work and back. That was it. His wife drove a little Hausfrau Porsche, a 924, nothing special. Most of the reporters had better cars than the owners. He didn't have a board or shareholders to answer to. It was all his. So the year after he died, the paper was sold off. And the new owners cleared $70-odd million profit the first year.
Unbelievable.
Stunning, just stunning. So that's how much he was plowing back in.
Yeah. I'm sure it's hard to fathom in some ways for some of the younger listeners out there who see it nowadays and can't imagine what a staple the Inquirer was. But it really was just this, like I said, this juggernaut. I mean,
and it was a different paper. It was a different paper. People liked the thing for quite a long time until Hollywood turned against the paper, reasonably enough. I don't totally blame them, because Pope's attitude was that nice is not news when it relates to celebrities. Now, I did celebrity stories, but I didn't do a lot of them because, as I say, I was focused mostly on the paranormal. I mean, it was literally true that reporters, I had friends who would literally go to a celeb's house and gather up the garbage on garbage day before the truck got there. Take it off and go through it. And it actually became a staple of American journalism. They'd analyze, the garbage of the famous and see what they really were doing. We found people, some of these celebs, they were getting the Inquirer every week, because we found it in the garbage. They were reading it, But anyway, Hollywood turned against the paper, and the reasons were kind of good socially interesting ones. The Hollywood, what do you call it, the studio system, folded in the 70s. And under that old system, a celebrity would make 2, 3, 4 films a year, and he was under contract, and he earned money, but not serious money. But they had a long, long career. You know, I'm talking about the John Waynes and the Cary Grants, and people of that old school movie making school. Mm-hmm. Well, they had a cozy relationship with the press. They were established. People knew them. They got to see them at the movie house, you know, and they were kind of their family, and it was all cozy. And so all the little and large peccadillos, the sins were covered up because the reporters knew that these guys are going to be there next week and next month and next year.
Right.
Well, when it came to, you know, the Julia Roberts time, when she made, you know, $20 million off one movie, and then you don't see her around again. Actually, that's a bad example because you do see her around. But when you got to these, you know, these 1- and 2-shot stars who made a lot of money in a short time, they knew that they couldn't afford to have nasty stories circulating about them. So they got their watchdogs out there, and they shut down, and they don't deal with the press. They just don't deal with the press anymore. It's very tightly controlled. Far too much at stake for them these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then you get things like TMZ and stuff, and like these paparazzi that are following them like everywhere. It seems like it's gotten even more intense too.
Yeah, it's true.
While we're sort of staying on the eccentricities of Gene Pope, there were two sort of like great searches that you detail in the book that I thought were just like amazing glimpse into the lengths that he would go for a story. Those were the search for utopia.
John Harris. John was a lovely man from North Carolina, and he spent, you know, I've forgotten the numbers now. I detail the thing in the book because I had the file in front of me then, but John went off on probably a 4 or 5 or 6 month search. He went around the world looking for utopia. And he filed his report from this place and that place. There was always something wrong with it. You know, there was too much traffic, or the climate wasn't right, and finally he found it. He found this place in the South Pacific, and he filed his report. And he'd been through 2 editors had been fired, or 2 of his editors had been fired while he was on the road. And Maury Breacher was his current editor then. Maury's still around, and Maury, you know, went in, Mr. Pope, I think we found utopia. You know, the climate's this, the economy's that, is perfect. Everything's perfect. Pope read it, and for once he couldn't find a flaw. It was wonderful. And Breacher walked out of Pope's office on a little cloud, you know, and he got back to his desk, and his phone went, and it was Gene Pope, Mr. Pope wants to see you come back in kind of thing, you know. And Breacher goes back in, and he said, Maury, he says, how did Harris get this story? He said, well, he phoned it over, Mr. Pope. You know, he phoned it in, and my secretary took it. He phoned it? You mean there's phones there? There's phones there? It ain't paradise, he said. Not utopia. And he killed the story right there and then. John had been around the world for half a year. He spent God knows how much money, you know, that didn't matter. And it was spiked, not one mention.
Jesus. Talk about a dream job in a way, though. I mean...
John said that was probably the ultimate job for any journalist anywhere, you know, to go and do that.
Yeah, just sent out in search of paradise. And
I once took 6 readers who'd won a ghost contest to Europe for several weeks. Mm-hmm. So there were 6 of them, photographer and myself. And I set it up, and we stayed in Hilton's, and we went to the UK first, and then to France, Italy, and into Germany. And we went to interesting sites, and we met interesting people. 3 weeks. Do you know how many words got in the paper? 320 and 1 picture. 320 words. And it was a bland little story, you know. It was not because we'd not done interesting things, because, well, it was just a prize. You know, they were doing it, and, you know, we went to these. I mean, you think now what somebody would do? They'd trumpet that thing. Look what we do for our readers. Didn't matter. Just it was nothing. You know?
Yeah, it was very strange. Yeah. Well, there's some other sort of similar stories like that I want to get to in a minute. The other great search I wanted to talk about, because it just shed some light on Gene Pope in a little bit of a way, and that's that he wanted to have the world's or the country's largest Christmas tree every year, and sent his man there, you know, to amazingly great lengths to get these like 140-foot
Christmas trees and stuff like that.
That's right, yeah. It was a tremendous operation. That's one I do detail in the book. I think that story, and originally it wasn't even my story. It was, it came from Hayden Cameron, who was the guy who went on it. But I retell it in the book. Hayden went off to where I am now, actually, here in the Great Green Northwest. He came around Washington and Oregon looking for the giant perfect spruce, And when they found it, the first one he found was the conditions were too dry. They couldn't cut it and get it out of the woods because it was too dry. And if you drag a tree like that, you cause friction, and you could cause a forest fire. So they went off, and they said, this won't do. So fortunately, the company's secretary who'd come to supervise this business, they sent a rail car to carry this tree 3,000 miles back to headquarters. He remembered that they'd talked to some Native Americans on their reservation, and they realized that they wouldn't be bound by federal law, so, you could cut the tree there. So they go along, and these guys say, well, what we'll do is we'll do a rain dance, you see, and then we'll get the rain, and that'll damp everything down and be perfectly all right. Well, the old guys have forgotten how to do it. So they pocketed the money and disappeared into the woods. And they still didn't have the tree. Anyway, they did find a tree that was going to do the job. And they brought in an enormous amount of equipment. They ended up taking it out with a helicopter, with a big logging helicopter.
Yeah.
So they lifted it out of the woods so it wouldn't drag on the ground. And then they carried it to its rail car, and then they took the rail car right across the continent. And the preparations for it were just amazing. It had to withstand, Beaufort scale force 8 gale. So they had this concrete bunker built for it with massive stage and massive wire ropes to hold it in place. And when it was all in, Pope came out and he looked at it and he says, it doesn't look right. These big trees don't have the sweeping low branches like your Christmas tree, 6-foot Christmas tree.
Right.
So he went and got more branches, and then a team of Hell's Angels came and nailed them all on, and they were so heavy they had to have hidden wires supporting them. And then the whole thing had to be decorated, 100,000, or whatever it was, 100,000 lights, 10,000 giant bulbs on it, all this stuff.
My God, yeah.
It was it was $1 million tree every year, and I think it ran for, was it 11 years, something like this. It ran for a long time.
Yeah, and you say in the book something like 4 million people over those years came to see this.
Oh, every
Christmas
snowbird
thing
in America came down to Florida to see it. The gardens, because the Enquirer gardens, they're fairly extensive, the grounds, and they were full. I had 2 small children at the time. Still got them. They're a bit bigger actually now. But the grounds were just full of everything: toy trains running around, animated characters, animatronic characters, lights. It was a fairyland. It was a sort of, probably 30-acre fairyland. It seemed like, all the grounds were decorated. It took months to get it ready, and people would come in from everywhere. They'd come from, you stop and think about it, it's Christmas time, you're in Michigan and it's freezing, and your wife says, why don't we go and look at that big Christmas tree in Florida? Good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it's strange because he seemed like such a cold guy, but then around Christmas time, at least he has this sort of, generosity of
he
sorts.
Got sentimental then, yeah, absolutely sentimental. We used to get a ham or a turkey. Every member of the staff was given this. That was ridiculous. We were very well paid, but he had to give us all a ham or a turkey at Christmas. And one guy was in a Mooney cult. He'd infiltrated this cult to report on it, and the office had to know whether he wanted a ham or a turkey for Christmas, because Pope said find out. Instead of just saying, well, we'll put both on one side for him. And some assistant there spent 3 days getting a secret message to him, and for the guys in there, and he's going out of his mind. They don't let you sleep in those cults. They brainwash you. They constantly accompany you. And the guy was going crazy, and finally a secret message comes. He thinks, oh, they're going to get me out of here. And it says, do you want a ham or a turkey for Christmas?
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
But if Pope said it, it had to be that way. That was the end of it. And it actually reflected in the product, in the paper itself, because you have an idea. Tim Binnell says, why don't we go and cover the haunted Ford pickup truck, in Knob Noster, Missouri or something. And or he'd say there's a ghost in the truck. There's a ghost in this truck in Knob Noster. And that idea went on to a lead sheet, and that lead sheet was approved. It was called, first of all, there were an editor who go through the things and cull it down until he got only the best ones went. And then GP would see these, Pope would see these, and Pope would approve that one, right? Okay, there's a ghost of a man in a pickup truck in Knob Noster. Mm-hmm. Well, the reporter goes there and he finds there's two ghosts in the thing. The story would be killed. It wasn't what Mr. Pope had approved.
Right.
It was ludicrous. Absolutely, you find a better story, and it's ludicrous.
Yeah. That was an interesting aspect of the book Tabloid Man, was just some of the quirks of the way the writing was done there. Because you make a point too that you were the reporter. You went out and you compiled all this information into like these massive files and had to get as much information as possible. And then these stories were actually written by rewriters who wrote the stories for the tabloids.
Yeah. It nearly cost me my job in the first month or two I was there, because when I was on my tryout, I've been working for several national newspapers at different times in the UK. And I was sent out immediately, on the road. I spent, 3 or 4 weeks on the road. I was in San Francisco, whatever. And I was sending these stories back, and they were the story I'd been sent on, go and talk. I remember one of them, actually, was about the guy who discovered the formula for happiness, and I went and interviewed him in San Francisco. I mean, he was crazy. But I filed the story, and it hadn't run, and I'm on the road. I don't know what's there. I just see the paper. I think, well, it's going to take 2 months to get it in or something. I don't know. And my editor was promoted for the third time in a month. It was an expansion time. And the new editor comes and he said, I've got your old files. He said, the crap. Well, I'm sorry. I said, what's wrong? He said, well, you've got this. He said, how do we know he's a doctor? I said, well, where did he go? Where was he trained? I said, well, he was at, such and such a hospital. He did his internship at that one. But you don't say that in the file. I said, well, no, he's a doctor. I just say he's a doctor. No, we don't want that. What they wanted was the guy's age, his shoe size, where he trained, where he did his internship, what degrees he had, what fellowships he was, what things he was a member of. And it was a whole great big fat 2,500-word legal file for a 200-word story. So everything in it was backed up. That was the big phrase. It had to be backed up. How do we know it? It's got to be backed up. And then that file would go to a rewrite guy who'd boil it down to the 200 words I'd written in the first place.
Right.
And that's the way it was all the way through until after Pope's death, and then it went to, well, distillation of what this morning's New York Post had to say,
Yeah, exactly. Now, was there like a reasoning behind that it was that way?
Pope wanted everything to be accurate, and he employed we had a whole department, a research department that started its life to help the reporters find facts, but very rapidly became kind of a truth squad, and they would literally take your interview tapes. You had to tape interviews. Every direct quote in the Inquirer had to be on tape and checked that it was on the tape. So some poor wretch had to, and there was a team of them doing this, had to listen to the reporter's interview tapes while they had his copy in front of them, and they would put a dot over every word that was in direct quotes to prove that if they heard it on the tape.
Yeah.
So they'd say this word was definitely on the tape. In the right order, the quote was definitely there as it was, It was ludicrous. So of course we had to find ways around that because it was crippling. It was, you could report a true story, but it might be the fellow you'd say, was it really amazing when this happened? And the guy would say, yes. Well, he didn't say, was it really amazing? So what we'd do is we'd write the story and then we'd call the guy and read it back and say, look, this is the story that's going to go in. What do you think? He said, that's fine. And that was okay on the tape. Well, that was all right until a couple of freelancers in Los Angeles decided to do a whole series of celebrity stories that they totally made up and read back on tape to their friends. Well, this couple made something like $300,000 in 18 months in story fees until they got one wrong. It was Tom Selleck having a romance with Victoria Principal, only he was in Hawaii and she was in Germany. It was kind of difficult. And they stumbled on that one, and it all came unglued. Their scheme came unglued.
Now, you sort of like traced us through how these stories ended up, being made. How did you, since you were sort of like the paranormal guy, how did you end up getting mixed up into the celebrity wing of things? Did they just come to you with the story and be like, Paul, we need you to go do this, this?
Yeah, obviously, I didn't exclusively do stories about the paranormal. I do the occasional crime story or whatever. For instance, I was the first guy out of the States to get to the world's worst air crash in North Africa, in Tenerife. I heard a friend call me from the UK. I was home in Florida Sunday afternoon, and within an hour I was on my way to the airport in Miami, and I flew to London. I cried in line and got my way onto a full flight to Madrid, and then had to smuggle myself onto a ferry boat to get from Gran Canaria to Tenerife, because the flights were all closed down and the boat was full, and I had to do devious things to get on the boat.
Yeah.
So it took me 28 hours to get there, but I was the first person on the station. And I was there for a couple of weeks and got tapes of the last 8 minutes of conversation between the tower and the jumbos.
Now, why do you think, we're talking about how extensive and how, massive the money was put into the Inquirer to get these stories and stuff like that. Why do you think it got such a bad reputation? Because it would publish on anything? It would cover all the strange stories that the mainstream media wouldn't look at, or that it covered gossip back before the normal newspapers did?
It was gossip and negative stories about celebs, I think, that got it. And then, of course, it also came back to this attitude of, we've got to get the story that was on the lead sheet. So if some clown, puts up an idea that drinking 8 glasses of orange juice a day will cure arthritis, and Pope approved it, then it was the reporter's job to go and stand that story up. And what it would do, and his editors were all terrified for their jobs, their fat paychecks, so they would push to get that. If you didn't get it, you're out. So what would happen is that on those, I was really lucky because I was doing paranormal, and the stories were weird enough that it didn't, I could report what was there and it was okay.
Right.
But say that medical story. So some poor reporter would call 30 doctors and say, does drinking all this orange juice do this? And 29 would say, no way, you're a clown. And the 30 would say, well, it's possible, I suppose, if. And if you could find 2 who'd say that, you had the story, you had the headline. Well, it became incredible. People aren't stupid. And, when they get stories like this, even though on the medical stories, because there were issues of responsibility, and the Inquirer actually had all their arthritis stories and all their cardiac type stories. The American Heart Association reviewed every story for a while before it went in, and had the veto power. And because they had the ultimate authority was that they could tell their members not to cooperate with us, you see.
Yeah.
And the same for, other medical associations. But when they were running the fantastic stories, and people aren't stupid, and eventually they work it out that, look, this stuff, and we never, the chief editors, the chief editor himself actually, at the time said, we don't want to confuse the reader with arguments. So it was all black and white. It wasn't, well, there's an interesting bit of research here that suggests that orange juice cures arthritis. It does it, and that's that. It's a nonsense. It was just a nonsense, and that just undermined the whole thing, and eventually the whole edifice fell in,
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Now, being in the paranormal community for a long time and having looked at all the stories here from the era and stuff like that, there's a lot of sort of conjecture that Gene Pope obviously he admittedly was involved with the CIA at some point, that this whole operation was sort of, done at the behest of the CIA to undermine certain stories or for a whole bunch of nefarious reasons. So what do you think of the idea that he was involved,
I've heard those conspiracy theories. I don't give them a lot of credence, to be honest. Pope said he'd been in a psychological warfare unit, which actually I found very credible because of the way he treated his staff. But I can't honestly think that if you were going to discredit research into psychic functioning, that you'd do it through a popular paper. I would have thought you'd get to some leading scientists and blackmail or bribe them into submission, to falsify their results. It would seem to me to be much more efficient. Because, frankly, convincing a housewife in Kansas City that something's real isn't going to have any political effect, really. But you see, on the other hand, and I know this personally, that I wrote a book for Gene Dixon, and so Gene and another commercial psychic called Joan Quigley in San Francisco advised presidents. Now, Jean was a very shrewd businesswoman, but she was no psychic. And I don't think that Joan Quigley actually would sort of make Obama's advisory board as an academic. But in fact, there was a book. What does Joan say that somebody wrote about Nancy Reagan's dependence on this psychic's advice, which is stunning to me.
Yeah.
But Jean certainly was close to the White House. She was close to a lot of politicians, and she sort of did the crystal ball routine for them, which is amazing to me. That but then again, we've been blessed with some presidents who are not noted for their intellectual qualities.
That's for certain. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, to the Inquirer's credit, I've also, because I was born in '79, so I sort of missed the big boom. But people I've talked to in ufology have often said that some of the best UFO reporting was in the Inquirer in the '70s and '80s. So
yeah, that's no credit to me at all. The chief reporter of UFOs was a guy called Bob Pratt, a nice man actually. He died about 3 years ago. Very determined and diligent reporter. And the Inquirer did carry good UFO stories. Partly because of that, they had good ties to MUFON and other. They didn't discredit people like Jacques Vallée or whoever who had the more fantastic stories. But they did carry the powerful ones, like the Pascagoula fisherman, and I actually did one in the UK for them, which was pretty well regarded in that field, although I didn't know it at the time. And that was what was his name now? Gosh, I can't recall. I worked with Edgar Mitchell, for 3 months. And this is a measure of the Inquirer and the way they went into the paranormal.
Yeah.
They took the sixth man to walk on the moon, and the lunar lander pilot, a very, very respected man, Dr. Mitchell, as he is, of course. He founded the Institute of Noetic Science in San Francisco. They took him and they hired him as a consultant for 3 months. And he and I traveled around the States together. We went to the Menninger Foundation. We went to IONS, of course, in San Francisco. Went to various places, and he introduced me to his contacts. I went into DARPA, the Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency in Washington. Got good cooperation, This would be in 74, 75, something like this. And so we actually got to things. And Ed told me a wonderful UFO story. He'd gone out to White Sands, where they were preparing to put, a rocket up into orbit, and one of his contacts there said, "Do you want to come and look at this?" Ed was in the military. He was, I believe, he was a Marine pilot. I'm not sure if he was Marine or Navy now, but he showed him a film. They'd had a high-speed camera trained on the bird, before it was fired.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody noticed this thing, a Frisbee-sized UFO, circling it like a hummingbird, going up the length of the rocket, and had the wit to turn the camera on, so they got some high-speed film of it, which is, just exactly what you'd want.
Yeah.
So Ed viewed this and was really impressed. And a few days later, he was talking to somebody else in the program and said, "Look, you've got to see this film. It's incredible." And the thing had vanished and never existed. Now, I totally believe, a man of his training and integrity, and one of America's heroes, an astronaut. But it just never existed. That film never existed. But he'd seen it. He said, "I saw that, and that totally convinced me." So
Strange.
there's evidence out there somewhere.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what keeps us all going here, it seems. And you talked about the trip there with the readers to do the ghost tour there in England, and reminded me of the other story in the book, and that's how you spent all this time. Now, the name of the country escapes me, but you were covering Hurricane Fifi.
Oh, in Honduras, yeah.
Yeah, and spent a long time there, and all these different amazing adventures and stuff. And when you got back, you said it took months for one story to be approved in the Inquirer.
Well, some stories, actually no stories that got in. They had a melange, a mishmash, a whole collection of stories that there were two of us, two teams. There was two teams of two, a photographer reporter team, and one set Vince Eckersley and Bill. One team went off to one part of Honduras, and the photographer Jeff Joffe and I were in around Choloma and Tegucigalpa. Anyway, we'd filed. What had happened was this giant hurricane came in off the Caribbean, went right across the peninsula, right across the landmass and into the Pacific. It killed about 12,000 people. They really don't know. But it hit the hardwood in the mountains and knocked all these giant trees down. They all came down in the floods. And the Hondurans had recently built a new road with about 17 bridges up along the coast. Well, all these logs formed a whole series of dams, backed up the rivers, and then one by one the bridges blew, and anything on the ocean side, was swept away. So we were doing stories. I mean, I went into a place called Choloma, and the thing was 9 feet deep in silt. The houses were what houses were left. Because, if you get a big hardwood tree, hits it in a flood, at 20 miles an hour, it's gone.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm doing all these, and one of the stories I came across was a youth who'd been on the roof of his house. This massive wood and mud and flood and stones came down, and somehow he got hold of a log and was swept out of sight of the mountains. He was swept at least 15 miles into the sea. Fluke of the current brought him back in within a few miles. And he was out for a couple of days. And some people out there, fishermen or somebody out sorting through the debris, found him alive and brought him back. Well, it's a tremendous story, I mean, this guy has survived being, smashed to death and eaten by sharks and drowned and out of sight of the land. I mean, that's a long way out. And I filed a story, and Gene Pope saw it and said, "This isn't a hurricane story. This is a lost at sea story," and he killed it. It didn't fit the formula. But they couldn't find an intro for the whole story. They wanted to run sort of 3 or 4 pages in the paper, and they couldn't find an introductory paragraph that pleased him. And it took about 5 months before they found one. And when at the end of it, it was so tame. And I remember it was "Death rode the slopes to Choloma." Sound like a ski film,
Yeah. Well, it's just amazing to contrast that story with what we see today. I mean, this is a disaster on par with stuff that we're seeing nowadays. And now you see, CNN or somebody fly somebody out there and they do 24/7 coverage. It's like
right.
To see the type of material you were procuring, and then to hear that it took months just to get it out there is stunning. To think about the difference in how things have changed.
Yeah, indeed. but it was, it was. He thought nothing of sending anywhere in the world, and that's what it was. That's what you did. It was. They were good stories, good meaty stories, and in that case, actually, probably the delay didn't matter because there'd probably be very little coverage of a Honduran hurricane anywhere in the North American press.
Yeah. So you guys were just
good human stories, that were selling the paper.
Exactly, yeah. Now, obviously this guy's reputation loomed over the whole office and everything, but how much personal interaction did you have with Gene Pope? Did you run into him a lot, or was it sort of few and far between your meetings?
No, he knew who we were. He knew his report. I was a senior reporter. There were about 80 reporters, and 6 of us were senior.
Oh, okay.
Which was a pay scale thing as much as anything. But, so he knew who I was. I mean, and actually, in a sneaking sort of way, I kind of liked the guy, and for instance, I went into a restaurant, in Boynton Beach or somewhere where we were living, and with my wife, and we were sitting there, and he and his wife came in, and he kind of noticed me and didn't do anything, didn't acknowledge or anything, and I thought, oh, good, okay, he's not recognizing me, I'm safe. And 2 minutes later, there's a bottle of wine on my table, he'd sent it over. So, he wasn't, he let his dog eat off his plate,
Yeah.
But he'd fire the gardener if the grass was more than 3 inches high, because that's what he said it had to be.
Yeah. Just a fascinating guy. I mean,
absolutely complex man, and a very single-minded, very purposeful person. And because he had this vision of what he wanted in his paper, there was nobody to argue with him. He didn't. You know what they say, Tim? They say that a camel is a horse designed by a committee.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he knew what he wanted, and there was no committee involved.
Right.
And what he wanted is what he got, and that's why the paper did so well. It was a great. The product was, what he wanted. He wanted it to be an interesting product. We used to carry about 80 stories a week in there.
Oh wow!
So actually, here's that shameless plug. But I have about 85 stories in Tabloid Man,
mm-hmm.
and that would be. And they're written a little bit longer, but that would be about the content. Well, they're written a lot longer, actually, thinking about it. There's 85,000 words in there, but they're written longer. But that would be, those stories written shorter would be 1 week's Enquirer. So you stop and think about that for your 35 cents. It's a good deal.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, the Enquirer's 35 cents.
Yeah, back then, yeah.
No, and people liked it. I mean, I walked into not Rosalind Carter's, Jimmy Carter's sister's house, in just outside Plains, and she's sitting there playing cards with Miss Lillian, and she introduced me. She said, "Oh, here's Paul. He's from the Enquirer." And Miss Lillian goes, "Oh, hi, how are you doing?" It was acceptable, enough to be from the Enquirer for a while.
Unless you're Sally Field, right?
I'll tell the story. If you've seen Sally Field in Mrs. Doubtfire when she's raging at her husband. Well, I've seen the real thing. Some idiot Enquirer editor sent me to. She was having a romance with Burt Reynolds, and they said, "Go and find her and get her to tell all about her romance, as if that's going to happen." So I go and find her house, and it was in Hollywood, and it was actually up for sale. And as I'm sitting there in the car, the gates open, and Sally drives in with her 2 kids. She just brought them home from school. So I walk through the gates, it's all right. And a maid comes to the door, and I said, "I see that the property is for sale." And she said, just a minute, I'll go and get them, So Sally comes out all smiles and charms. She's only tiny, she's like 5'1" or something. She goes all smiles and absolutely oozing charm, and I said, "This is a very nice house, and you've got it for sale." "Yes, come in, I'm in there with her." I said, "I'm not actually here to buy the house." I said, I was here to ask you about your relationship with Mr. Reynolds. And actually, I do believe levitation's real, because she did it. She was furious. She was bouncing up and down next to me. But I've got my credentials. On assignment, I've been menaced by a ghost. I've been shot at by a gunman. Michael Jackson endangered me. I was kicked out, of course, by Gidget at Sally Field. A kangaroo spat on me, and I've been threatened by Tony Curtis, George Best, the French police, the Salvadorian military, Bob Hope's daughter, Stephanie Powers' brother, John Benet Ramsey's neighbors, a hitman in New Jersey. Princess Caroline's bodyguards.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just like I said, you've had an amazing life.
They chased me down. Oh, dear God.
But you made it through it. You made it through it all right.
Yeah, I still got the scars. Well, I played rugby for a long time, so I'm all right.
There you go. Now, you talked about how huge the Elvis issue was. I thought it was amazing to go back to sort of like the way things have changed and how around the clock the news is. It sounded like, when Elvis died, I think you said they spent $75,000 on reporting on this and flew a ton of people out there, rented out a whole floor of a hotel, had Winnebagos on standby in case you lost the hotel rooms. Right. It was amazing. Right.
Yeah, and actually all that logistics takes stuff. One thing I'll say for the staff is Pope did not employ incompetence. The people who worked for the Inquirer were some of the best journalists in America and, of course, from Britain. They had a lot of Brits. He recruited Brits because the British newspaper industry was extremely competitive, and still is, actually. Mm-hmm. There'll be a dozen or so morning papers in every city.
Oh, wow.
Well, the place is small. Britain's only the size of California.
Yeah.
And so a national newspaper goes everywhere. So you've got half a dozen national newspapers, a couple of regional ones, and a local one, or maybe even two, in every city. So, you can have a dozen morning papers on your table if you want them. Actually, it's slightly fewer now, but there's still plenty there, and that's in addition to TV and so on. Because of, the geography, you can actually print the thing in one or two printing centers and stick it on trains, and it's on the breakfast table.
Ah, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, the distribution problems in the States are horrendous,
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't consider that till you said that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was just amazed at how much they spent on that story when Elvis died. And obviously it generated, as you said, 7.2 issues, 7.2 million issues sold. Yeah. So it's like...
Yeah. It was a good return on it. There's a nice little side story after the Elvis thing because Pope, enjoyed the big sale. So he said, well, why don't, we need another Elvis story. So somebody came up with the idea of getting Priscilla Presley to pray alongside the grave in Graceland,
Mm-hmm.
And a good friend of mine, Vince Eckersley, was an Inquirer photographer, and so he bought himself a shiny black suit and a dog collar, and then he got himself a missal, a great big Bible or a missal. I think probably a missal for authenticity. Hollowed it out, and he put a little Leica camera into it with a remote trigger. You see?
Yeah.
And the idea was he was going to go in there disguised as a priest, and Priscilla would kneel down by the grave, and he'd kneel on the other side of the grave and take pictures of her praying for Elvis. So it was going to be another nice picture, good picture. Well, she got cold feet, and they never actually did the job. But he went to Memphis and hung around for about a week in a motel, waiting for her to warm her feet up to do it. They were paying her to do it.
Yeah.
And she never did. But while he's waiting, Bing Crosby, who was in Spain, had died. And Vince gets a call to go to L.A. because they're bringing Bing back to be buried, you see. So he goes to the church, I think it was in Westwood, and the night before the service, and they held a service early in the morning so there'd be no crowds, and they didn't advertise it, of course. And so Vince goes the night before, and he removes this diamond-shaped pane of glass from a church window, and he gets a long lens and has a convenient, box to stand on to get a picture when they put the coffin there at the head of the aisle at the nave. And so he gets his picture in the morning, and then he goes inside because he's dressed as a priest, you see.
Yeah.
And he's got his little concealed camera, and he's kneeling at the back, just loading some more film in. And a great big bearded priest comes striding down the aisle towards him. And, oh, gosh, I've been rumbled, you know. And he looks up, and it's Frank Zahor, another Enquirer reporter, dressed as a priest. So Vince kind of, you know, they bless each other. And Vince does his job, and he goes to the door, and the funeral director's keeping the press out. And this is Jerry Hunt, who's another Enquirer reporter. So anyway, Zahor takes his dog collar off, and he goes down to the graveside, you know. Oh, as he's leaving the church, still dressed as a priest, rather, he's stopped by one of the reporters from one of the LA papers and says, who's the officiating priest? And Frank says, you know, says his name, you know, his father's Strelewski or whatever. And he said, how you spell that? And he spells it. And he says, but my son, he says, check it. And then Frank told me, he said, I went down to the graveside, and by this time I was back into mufti, and I got my dog collar off and everything. And this reporter looks across at me, and here's Frank with a tape recorder and a notebook, and he's going, what's going on, you know? Frank says, it's a bit of freelance activity now.
Yeah. Oh, man.
So things happened.
Just unbelievable. Now, but, you know, people hear these stories here, especially, you know, a lot of the stories that you covered in the book, these paranormal stories, and these weren't really like you know, fluff pieces. Like a lot of the stuff you investigated was remarkably chilling, remarkably paranormal. I mean, this wasn't just hoaxes or fakes or you know, or trickery. I mean, you really investigated some strange things there.
The most important stories actually were things like the Stanford Research Institute and their remote viewing.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a couple of years working, not non-stop, of course, but I was in contact with Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. And these are not lightweight researchers. You know, Puthoff was a full professor at Stanford University, and Targ is a laser physicist. And they worked with Uri Geller. That's how they started it. You know, they were investigating Geller's abilities. And they were working for the Stanford Research Institute, or as it became now, SRI International.
Mm-hmm.
And they got a $1.1 million annual stipend from the CIA that ran for 9 years. So it was a $10 million contract to investigate remote viewing. Well, actually, that contract, when it expired there with them, I found out since, the contract ran for 20 years and for $25 million in total. And that's what the spooks were spending to try and train psychic spies. And they had tremendous success. And now the story that's going around is that, you know, the results were indecisive, and they abandoned it all and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But I tell stories in there about when, you know all about remote viewing, but I'm sure there's one or two listeners who might want it clarified. What they would do is, in the later stages, is they would have a talented remote viewer, who could be an ordinary person actually, who knew enough to relax the mind, kind of thing. They found it was important to assure that the test subject, it was okay to succeed. They said this was absolutely key, they found out. And then they say, okay, we want you to send your mind to these map coordinates somewhere in the world and tell us what you see there. And they give him a set of coordinates. Now, the best geographer in the world couldn't do this, you know, when you get latitude, longitude, and, you know, down to minutes of latitude.
Yeah. And
what they try and do is find, say, a small lake in a continent, or a small island in an ocean. And in one instance, one story that impressed me a lot, I think it was Ingo Swann was the psychic, and he was given these coordinates of the French Antarctic island of Kerguelen. And he went there and he described, you know, the wind and the grasses and all this kind of thing. But then they liked artists to be these subjects, and he sketched the island, and he accurately put in, you know, where everything was, the mountain and the airstrip and the one small habitation. The French had a meteorological station on the island. And he described it, and he got the shape of the island right, and the elevation, and the disposition of the buildings, all this stuff. But there was one thing that puzzled him, and he reported it, but he couldn't work out what it was. And it was a long orange, was it orange blob color, you know?
Mm-hmm.
and they couldn't get it. They didn't know what it was. I'm doing some of this from memory, of course. But anyway, he reported it. So when they had his report in, he's sitting in this lab, in Palo Alto, and he sent his mind 8,000 miles away around the world. And then Targan put off contact the authorities in Kerguelen and said, can you verify this? And they said, yeah, that's really our island, and that's how things are, and there are huts are there. There's the Nissen hut, there's the airstrip. So what's this orange thing? Well, no, that's not here. No, we don't have that. So when was this done? So they gave them the date and time, and the French came back and said, actually, it was here then. For 3 days, they'd been expecting some particular storm, and they'd covered up some Met equipment with a tarp, and that's what it was, the right shape, color, and size. So for 3 days, this tarp had been on. This equipment had been protected, and in that time, Swan had actually seen it and described it. That's pretty impressive. You think, well, that means it's contemporary. He's actually doing it. It's not that he could have cheated somehow and, looked in an atlas.
Right. Those are the sort of like little things, little details that lend credence to this whole thing.
Yeah.
Look, Todd, I know you're a big conspiracy theorist, okay? And you believe everything, man.
It's not
You're
true.
so naive, man. There are no aliens in Roswell, and contact lenses aren't made out of amoebas.
They are too,
dude.
You're listening to Banal of America Audio.
Hey, did you see that? What? Chupacabra. He just ran down the aisle, Todd. You better find him.
Now, you made a good point in the book, too, as a reporter, that it's important to listen and ask questions. I thought that was, it sounds so simple, but in reality, it really isn't.
Well, you won't know what the story is. If my trouble is I talk a lot. So I've got to shut up and let people get in. I mean, right now I'm on the receiving end of that, but you really do have to go, and it's remarkable what comes out if you actually pay attention to people and just listen to them, let them talk.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of things. I'm scrambling now, of course, for an example, but there's all kinds of things that will emerge if you let people tell you about them.
Right. People, I think, just want, they want to know that you care. They want to find somebody that wants to listen to them, even if it's some mundane thing. I think you said that, you'll learn that there's 7 different types of wool or something like that. And
oh, yes, yeah. They range from fair to middling fair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If somebody, I find that even just talking to random strangers, not guests on the show, but, if you express an interest in what they do, they can light up if they're not.
It's the joy, Tim. It's the joy of our jobs. We get to talk to people who are experts in their own area. It doesn't matter whether it's how paint adheres to a wall. If they're an expert on it, they will make that interesting to you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had an occasion when I didn't pay attention to somebody, and it was a pretty spooky episode. I'd gone down to Sao Paulo in Brazil to do some stories down there, and I came across a poltergeist attack that was going on in a nearby town, which is called Mogi das Cruzes. So I went out there, and I don't speak any Portuguese, and I had an interpreter with me. And this family had been kind of under siege. Now, you know, but I didn't, that in Brazil, witchcraft is very commonplace. It seemed like every street corner seemed to have a little shop that sold you dried lizards and things, that people would use. So I went to Mogi, and they told me that even the police chief had seen this. So I went to see him. It was a terrifying experience, actually. The police chief place. It was, oh gosh, it was a really scary building. You thought you were going to get banged up there and never come out. Anyway, he said that he'd gone to this house, and on a blank plaster wall, flames were appearing. And he realized that there was no heat from them, and he went up to them, and they were just the illusion of flames out of this wall. And he said he'd even put a banknote up in among them, and of course it didn't burn. And he'd witnessed this. Anyway, I went to the house, And things were going on there. In fact, one incident was while I was about 5 or 6 feet away from it, the back of this small sofa, it was an imitation plastic, imitation leather sofa, 3 gouge marks opened up in it, just split, 3 splits, as if somebody had clawed it. Just right next to me. I mean, I tell you this, and you're going to say, well, you were wrong, but I saw it and it happened, and that's very convincing to me anyway.
Yeah.
So I saw this and things were going on. Well, the family over the next day or two, they hired a witch doctor, a macumbera of their own, to take off this hex that had been put on them. And he was apparently quite successful, and things quieted down. And my interpreter says, look, we should really go and see the guy, and, you talk to him. And, well, at the end of the day, I was hot, I was thirsty, I'd had 2 or 3 days on this thing, and I was really ready to pull out and get back to Florida. And I said, no, he's not going to add any credibility. I need a scientist or somebody, We venerate people we shouldn't.
Yeah.
But it had to look credible. And I figured a guy in feathers and bones wasn't going to add anything to the story. So I just ignored it. Well, that night I was in Sao Paulo and I went out for my dinner. Well, actually, I had dinner in the hotel, and it was a chicken pot pie I was eating. And as I'm eating, I get this crunch, and I pull out a little cube of glass out of my food. And it was, when you shatter a windshield, you get these little tiny bits of tempered glass. And
yeah.
It was like that, just a little cube. So I'm very indignant, and the manager assures me, they didn't make it on the premises. They brought it, it wasn't their fault, and have a free dinner and all this stuff. And okay, pass on. Well, the next night I was back in Rio de Janeiro, and I was flying out of there the next morning. I was in a bar. I went in this, again, it was a hotel bar, nice bar, and I was having a mixed drink, and plunk piece of glass in my drink, in among the ice. Well, my glass wasn't chipped. The barman was very apologetic. He showed me this kind of rubber thing that they had that twirled, that they clean the glasses with. It couldn't have been chipped, but they didn't know how to come about. I was very sorry, have a free drink,
Mm-hmm.
Didn't think to it. Okay. The next night, third night, 24-hour cycle in between each. Not exact, but close. I'm thirsty, and I went to the fridge of my house, and I don't often drink sodas, but I was thirsty, and I went, and there was a Coke in there, and I take a Coke out, and I did something I don't normally do, maybe subconsciously I knew, and I opened it and poured it into a glass, and clink, there's that cube of glass again for the 3rd time. And all I can think is that macumbera sent me a message. He didn't harm me, he didn't scare me, he just said, come and listen to me. You should have paid me a bit more respect.
Exactly, yeah.
And, I mean, I'm not, it all happened just as I told you, and there's no point saying it did when it did, when it didn't. That's just exactly what happened.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It was an impressive message, anyway.
Now, another whole section in the book it deals with how the Inquirer and the tabloids covered politics and the presidents, and I thought it was interesting. They just really do develop some strange stories that rely on sort of shadowy sources. That as long as you can get a source off the anonymously, although you guys have to tell the editor who it is,
sometimes not even that. What you've done now is you've jumped forward to the modern tabloid, and you're right to, because people need to know. But yes, what they do now is they look. In fact, now the tabs are a shadow of themselves. I think the Inquirer's got about 3 or 4 staff reporters, and that's it. They've got 2 guys in Florida and 2 or 3 in LA, and that's it. They have no money. I was freelancing for them and for the Inquirer and Globe and Star until 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, the last story I did was Obama. It would be, where are we now? It would be just a little bit more than 2 years ago, about Obama and his birth certificate. And they're still running the story.
Yeah.
I went to they sent me to Hawaii and LA and so on to dig for any dirt we could find on him, and that was one of the stories that came up.
Yeah, he said it sounded like Obama. That his whole background had pretty much been scrubbed leading into him running for president, because you guys couldn't really get anything.
It's standard operating procedure actually these days. They make sure that if you've got anything in your background, it's either redacted, so it's not available to anybody else, or you cough it up. You know, you don't want to be brought up at an embarrassing time. And Obama cleaned everything, but he'd had people in there about 10 months before I got there. I'm talking 2007 when this first started.
Yeah.
And everything had been cleaned up. You know, his even down to his half-sister, Satoru, she was no longer listed at the university where she worked. She was no longer on the list, so you couldn't email her. I mean, it was... He'd taken everything off. I'm just trying to think where you even start. He took off his birth records, kindergarten records. There's records at Punahou School. Then he went to Occidental College in Columbia. They all vanished, as did his thesis. His Harvard Law School records have gone. The law review pieces he did, and he did scholarly stuff for the University of Chicago. Went his passport, medical records, even files from his years as a state senator in Illinois and as a member of the state bar there. They all went. And actually, this probably is one of the few conspiracy theories that has some legs. Why would he? When I did it, he'd spent $600,000 on 5 different law firms to keep this stuff quiet. And when Trump was making all his noise a few weeks ago, he claimed that Obama was now up to $2 million in legal fees. But why would you do all that? And this is purely a guess, because nobody knows yet. I think he probably had dual citizenship at some stage. His father was Kenyan, and his mother was, as everybody knows, Kansas girl.
Yeah. And
he actually went to Pakistan. Obama went to Pakistan in '81 when it was very difficult for any American to travel there. Now, if he'd had a passport from a Muslim country like Kenya, he would have been much more welcome. Maybe that dual citizenship would have shown up when he applied for college or, or the bar or whatever.
Interesting.
And maybe that's an embarrassment.
Yeah, interesting. I never even had considered that, but yeah, that's definitely a possibility. What I thought was interesting, too, was that you said that during the election that you did come across sort of this scandalous story involving John McCain and that it never got printed. And you said, and this is a quote here from the book, given a real scandal, the tabs didn't know what to do with it. I thought that was really interesting that, here they were trying to dig up, gay affairs for Obama and crazy stuff.
With that Sinclair bloke, that Larry Sinclair guy.
Yeah.
Totally unbelievable, truly incredible. And they had this thing with McCain, John McCain, who was touting family values and saying how how much joy he and Cindy had as adoptive parents. I think he said something like they knew what a treasure and joy it was to have an adopted child, but they actually booted out this young girl that they were adopting and left her to a life of drugs, crime, and hardship. And now, I'm talking about Bridget McCain, a girl who even changed her name during the adoption process, and then got into an argument with them, with Cindy. Cindy's got, some emotional roller coaster that she was riding at the time. She was abusing substances, and that's not a secret. But they pushed the thing into a dark corner. He's advocating adoption, and then he can't make one work for himself. But the tabs, I don't think they did it from any particular political reason. I think there's just incompetence. It's one of those things, well, it's not selling as well as, Bush is drunk every night, and Laura's, moving out and staying in a hotel.
Right.
Wish she did a couple of times, but,
Well, it's interesting, too, that, a lot of this stuff, especially the celebrity gossip and even the political gossip and stuff like that, I mean, that stuff's gone mainstream now. I mean, you don't need
horrible.
to get
it's really horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder how many people really, really care, about some Pop-Tarts romances.
It seems like a lot of people, unfortunately.
Do you think so? Do you think so, Tim? I mean,
I don't know.
They're not buying the paper.
That's true.
They're walking. True. They're voting with their feet. So maybe that's, I don't know. I mean, there are certainly. I think what it is because the tabloids are down to such, low levels of staffing and financing. They can't afford freelancers anymore.
Right.
But because of that, the few people who are operating them are pretty much exhausted. I suppose that might be a factor. They can't be creative forever.
Right. Now I think you see too, some of these magazines like Us Weekly and stuff, like, it seems like instead of this adversarial relationship, like what happened with the Inquirer and the celebrities, now they sort of work together.
You're right. Yeah, they do. They'll promote the celebrity's latest fashion line, that kind of thing. They're buying their way in.
Right.
Because the celebs have closed the door on them. That's what it is. They don't want any coverage from that they can't control. Obama was very smart during his election campaign. I admire Obama, to be honest, but he was very smart during his election campaign. They didn't put him up for press conferences. They issued their sound bites. They controlled what the press could do.
Yeah.
So it wasn't, you can put your own spin on it. The Bush campaign learned a lot from that, I think.
Well, you see, it's just a different world too, in a way, and you hear this just about journalism in general now, where it's like, instead of going out and getting the story, a lot of times the journalists are being told the story,
yeah,
and then they report what they're told, and somewhere the truth gets lost in the mix.
It's easier and cheaper to just take a press release and rewrite it than it is to go and dig around and have people really ticked off at you and maybe lose. And when you're struggling to survive, as the papers are, print media is really in desperate straits.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to take the line of least resistance. They're not going to alienate the sources they've got, because where do we get next week's stories? It's vicious, and of course they're not supported by the readers. The readers don't really seem to want the depth of reporting, because they don't support the media that gives it to them.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you've ever read there's a British magazine called The Economist. It does really good in-depth stuff. Nobody's ever heard of it, but it's a great read.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not as good as the baffling chair of death stuff, but but it gives you in depth, on the politics in Pakistan, or what really is happening with the Afghan drug trade. That they don't make the evening news here. This is more, what Elizabeth Taylor's funeral plans were.
Yeah, what Charlie Sheen's doing nowadays, right?
Yeah, I couldn't believe that, week after week of a train wreck.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, like I was kind of saying too. It's like back in the day, that sort of stuff didn't get on TV or in the mainstream papers. It was just you had to go to the Inquirer and tabloids like that to get that story. And now everybody, everything's become like the National Enquirer in a way.
And people, the thing is that the tabloids particularly have suffered from celebrity television, because people regard celebs as part of their extended family, and they get their satisfaction. They'll see a little bit on Entertainment Tonight. They'll see a tiny bit, a 15-second bite, and the show will tell you what they're going to tell you. They'll show it to you. They'll tell you what they told you, and they'll do it again. And you go, well, where was the meat in all that? It was all sizzling. There was not much steak there. I don't know. But it fulfills people's desires to see the family members, as it were. They want to see Charlie, how the bad guy's doing.
Yeah. Now, you did have a lot of interaction with celebrities. Was there any in particular that stood out to you as like your favorite ones to interact with? I thought the Tonya Harding stuff was particularly revealing.
Yeah, I like Tonya. Yeah, she was nice. My favorite celeb of all of them is Dan Haggerty, who played Grizzly Adams back in the day. I mean, Dan's a rogue, and he's had a very colourful, shall we say, past. But he's a nice, genuine guy, and very talented. Actually, he's an artist and sculptor and all this stuff. There's a funny story that happened. He was filming up in Lake Louise there in Canada, and I was up there, and he had to do this. Dan's an animal trainer, and he had to do a scene on a frozen lake with a Siberian tiger, where the tiger was supposed to come and attack this. I don't know what kind of a warrior he was. He was covered in furs anyway. He was some primitive warrior. You know, this tiger runs out the woods and grabs Dan and wrestles with him, which was going to work fine. So to keep it authentic, or convincing at least, the film crew were all hidden just inside the tree line, and they filmed it from 3 or 4 spots, you see. And Dan's out in the lake, and they released the tiger. So anyway, that night we're all in the hotel, you know, in the bar in the hotel, and there was a whole lot of women in there. They were members of they call it the Bitch and Stitch Club, and they were having their meeting, and one of these women got talking to us and said to Dan, "Where are you doing?" And he said, "Well, we're filming on this lake here near here," and mentioned the name. And she said, "Oh, my husband was there today. He was ice fishing." She said, "He came home absolutely white and shaken." I said, "What happened?" "Well, he'd been smoking dope, and he said he was never going to do it again because he started hallucinating about the Siberian tiger, and he'd had a flashback in time." She said, "I'm not going to tell him." Dan explained what had gone on. We were killing ourselves laughing. She said, "I'm not going to tell him. He can stop smoking that stuff for a while."
One of the stories in the book that I thought was really amazing, to go back to sort of the paranormal realm so I don't get too many nasty emails, was this story of Howard Starkle and his abilities here that I guess are classified under the term psychometry. So I guess talk a little bit about that and you know, what you gleaned from this guy's amazing abilities, because this was some stunning stuff. Like, as you get into the story and you're reading more about it, you just keep getting further and further into it, and you're like, this is, you know, this can't be denied. This is stunning stuff.
No. There's a federal researcher. His name's Neil Mangum, Dr. Neil Mangum. He was a chief historian at the Custer Battlefield National Monument. And he'd heard about this man from Raleigh in North Carolina, Howard Starkle, and decided to sort of call him in to see if he could help. Starkle says that he watches a mental TV screen when he handles clothing or weapons or artifacts from a scene. In this case, you know, the battlefield. It was at the Custer Battlefield, and he gets pictures of what happened to the owners of those artifacts. He was given, for instance, an iron spur that Mangum had dug out. Mm-hmm. And he described a big man, and he said he was someone. And now this, all this material is recorded and transcribed. So, you know, it's not I'm making it up. This is something that this historian was so impressed with that it came to me eventually.
Yeah.
So he described a big man. He said someone in medicine who was wounded in the foot and was struggling to climb a hill with a small group of cavalrymen. And Starkle described the man as his thoughts. He said, "I saw the Indians killing our horses by the stream." He said, "Our group of soldiers wasn't the main group with Custer. The Indians killed some of us, then backed away. They set fire to the grass around us as they left." He said, "I was hatless, you know, without his hat. I was hurting and in a panic. I lost my spur below the ridge." And then he goes to the present tense. He said, "My boot is full of blood. It's hard struggling up the hill. There's an Indian with a big bullseye painted on his chest. He's on horseback and he's riding me down. At any second, I might be cut down." He said, "I shoot at him, but there's a crushing pain in my chest, and I know I'm mortally hit. I'm dying now. The noise seems very far away." So, okay, I said, "Well, what's the real story?" So the historian says, "It happened." He said, "The spur was iron. The reason they gave it to him is unusual. He said it was iron. It wasn't military issue brass. And it almost certainly belonged to an army contract surgeon called James DeWolf, who was probably the only man on the battlefield with non-issue spurs." And now the guy who told me that was Dr. Donald Rickey. He was 5 years the historian at the battlefield, and he's not just anybody. He was assistant director of the U.S. Army Military History Institute. So he's actually got, you know, a reputation, and he's careful. He's a careful researcher. Right? He said the spur was found just where the psychic said it was, just below the ridge where DeWolf's body was found. And De Wolf was with Major Marcus Reno's battalion, which was a small part of Custer's force. So that all set, that sort of, fitted exactly with what he said. And even the scene that he saw through the doctor's eyes, that Starkle saw through the doctor's eyes, was confirmed. The Sioux and the Cheyenne, they actually did kill cavalry horses by the stream, and they did set fire to the grass as they moved off after Custer. And they found horse bones, in the wall of the stream and all the rest of it. But it wasn't the only test. They tested him with cartridge shells that they found at Little Bighorn, and he described accurately where each was found. But one of them puzzled him. He said, "How could this be?" And he duplicated this Indian's action of loading his carbine. And he was trying to, Starkle, the psychic, was trying to slap the bullet into the rifle butt. He said, "It can't be. This is how you load a rifle." And Mangum, the historian, said, "It was a Spencer cartridge, and you load it through a tubular magazine that goes to the butt plate of the rifle." The psychic was correct.
Yeah.
And they brought other things up, Tim. There was a Martin .50 shell case, and it brought back a memories from an Indian warrior who'd fired it at the battle, and who was thinking of his squaw who'd been killed 18 months before. And the psychic gave them details, and the historians pieced together the tale of, they call it the Bates fight at Snake Creek in Wyoming, where 3 squaws were killed just as the psychic had described it, from handling this bullet, fired hundreds of miles away.
And hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, well, 1876, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, so stunning. I mean, like I said, how can you... These are the kind of stories that just leave you flummoxed, really, about what this is, what
they
we're
absolutely
dealing
do.
with.
Absolutely do. And, is somebody's tapping into somebody else's consciousness 150 years on, How do they do that? It's astounding. Actually, this wasn't the most astounding, psychic story I've done, but it's good, convincing evidence from very, very credible witnesses, and people who've researched it themselves. It's not, I heard it from my mother-in-law.
Now, growing up, did you have an interest in this sort of subject, or were you did you just sort of gravitate towards it as you became a reporter?
Not particularly. When I was very small, we lived in a Victorian house. It was quite a large house. It had been a splendid house long before we got it. And I actually did see a ghost of an old man. I didn't know he was a ghost. This little old man, and I saw him twice, and he was doing the same thing each time, just going across a landing and into my parents' room. And I mentioned it to my mother. I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and said, "Who's that man upstairs?" And described him, and she said, it's Mr. Isherwood, the previous owner of the place. And there was no alarm or concern about it. It wasn't, spooky in any way. But I had that personal experience. But no, I can't say I was particularly interested. Which in a way is a good thing, because I wasn't predisposed to either accept stuff or deny it,
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at with the question. You didn't go into these stories as a true believer. You went into them, trying to uncover the story. I think at one point...
and they're interesting stories, that's the thing as well. Some of them are so fake it's not true. For instance, they sent me to a place in Pompano Beach. There was a fellow there, and he had some medical condition, and I think if he tensed up, he could actually make blood pop out of his forearms. And he was persuading gullible people that he was a reincarnation of what was it? What did you call it? Princess Tara. That was it, Princess Tara. So some Egyptian princess. I'm not kidding. This is true. People believe anything. So anyway, I go along, and he's there with one of his acolytes. He's lying on this. He said, "I'll bring the princess through now," and he's going to be a medium, and he lies on a bench, and he folds his hands across his chest, and then he changes his voice and says, "I am the Princess Tara from 3000 BC." So I said, "How do you know it's BC, princess?"
Ah.
And he says in this voice, he says, "Do not mock me, mortal." I'm going, "All right, you phony." 3000 BC.
Now,
3000 more years we'll be there.
Yeah. When you went to, investigate these stories and stuff like that, if it was a no-go, that was okay with the folks at the Inquirer?
Oh, yeah, sure. That was the thing. That was fair. If I came back and said, hey, it doesn't work, that's the end of it. With a celeb story, they'll say, well, find something else about them,
Yeah.
But with parapsychology, no, it just doesn't work, mate, Although once they sent me to talk to interview a talking cat. I've interviewed a talking gorilla, but that's something else. So I go all the way out to Knobnoster, Missouri, which is where I can never forget that name, to meet Mrs. Nellie Frerking, God love her. And she wasn't a bit surprised that somebody come all the way across country to see her and a talking cat. I think the cat's name was Maisie. And I'm thinking, this is going to be really interesting, And I said, can we? Yeah, come in. She says, okay, talk to the gentleman, Maisie. And after a bit of prompting, the cat said, it's one-word vocabulary. Mommy. That was it. It was kind of a cross between a meow and a yawn.
Oh, man.
Oh, dear me.
One thing that people can check out, we'll play it here on the show, but people can also check it out at the website, BannisterBooks.com, and there's links all over Binnall of America for that, folks. You should be able to find it quite easily. Is this EVP that you captured during a phone conversation with someone in the UK, and I'm not doing the story very good justice, so why don't you talk about it, we'll play the EVP for folks.
Excellent. I still get a prickle in my neck, actually, in the back of my neck when I listen to this thing. The situation was I was interviewing a woman called Ray Koch, and she was the curator of the old stone house on M Street in Washington, D.C. It's still there. Presumably it's supposed to be the oldest house in Washington. And off the top of my head, I don't remember. It was probably built in the 17th century. And I know that the earliest occupants were, for about 100, 150 years, were English families. They handed it on down, I guess. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I was the place it's a National Park Service facility. It's visited daily by the public. And they'd been having a lot of trouble with ghosts in the place. There was one particular man, a bull-like man. A lot of people had come in and complained. They didn't know he was a ghost. He was trying to push them down the stairs. These are visitors to a national park site, and they would come and find the curator and say, who's that man upstairs? He's so angry and he's pushing us. And we got into it. They didn't even know he was a ghost. And so he was obviously able to do some physical thing if they could push them. Yeah. Which is, again, really unusual. So anyway, Ray's describing these different ghosts. They've got 4 male ghosts in there and 2 female ghosts, and then there's a child ghost who runs along the upper corridor or upper balcony. I've not been to the house, to be honest, but they'd seen and heard him. And while I'm doing a phone interview with her, and I said something like in the interview, I said, well, how many ghosts have you got in there, Ray? Let me see, is it 5 or 6, and then there's a small one. And then she starts to tell me, she's talking, and then over her voice comes a voice that corrects what I've just said. It says 4, 2, and a kid. So it wasn't me speaking, it wasn't her. And I didn't hear it during the conversation, which was absolutely interesting. Now, I write shorthand, and I took a shorthand note, and I was a bit unclear when I came to write the story, how many ghosts. And I went back to the tape, because I said, I asked her that. And I listened to the tape and nearly fell off my chair, because this voice comes in from nowhere and corrects what I just said. I got the number wrong. But I didn't hear it. And she obviously didn't hear it. She's talking. It's not a fake. It's not in any way hooked up. In fact, Tim, I have the original tape here still. I'd be willing to let anybody who's got the right credentials examine it. I have no qualms about that. But something came on, and an intelligence came on and corrected and provided accurate information. Stunning to me.
Right. And let's play it now for folks so they can hear what we're talking about.
When you say you've got 5 people in there, or you've got a child in there as well, have you ever seen that one, Sparrow?
At one time I used to have, now this is years ago, I used to have a little book.
And as you point out in the book, too, and as folks could hear there, hopefully, that the voice was like an English voice. It sounded like it had an English tone.
That's intrigued me because the earliest occupants of the place were English, according to what what I'd heard and what Ray had told me at the time, which would make sense because the early settlers anyway, in the East Coast and the Northeast were mostly from England or Germany.
Yeah.
And the voice actually, and I didn't say this, but it's true. The voice actually, to me, it's Midlands English. The accent is a genuine English accent. And if it it's a regional accent to sort of the almost north of Birmingham, in the UK.
Interesting.
Very impressive, actually.
And I'm looking here on Wikipedia just at the sheer number of stories that the Inquirer has broken, in recent years that turn out to be true. That get denied at first. It's pretty stunning here.
Some big ones. OJ, of course. They wouldn't have got OJ for the civil suit, at least. It was Inquirer who broke that. We were involved in that one. In fact, I wrote part of a book about OJ for American media. Gary Hart, he was a presidential candidate. Do you remember Monkey Business?
Oh, yeah.
Gary Condit, he tried to sue us. Condit was involved with Chandra Levy, of course. I was on that story. That was kind of a messy story. He obviously did not, he wasn't involved in her murder in any way. They found some Salvadorian who'd done that. But he lost his career as a member of Congress. John Edwards, of course, he lied repeatedly. He was another presidential candidate. These are all good stories. But the Inquirer, they dropped the ball on one. And I tell that story in Tabloid Man about Jonestown.
Yeah.
Because GP didn't give it credence. And if they'd acted on it and done the story, they'd probably save those 900 people.
Right. What I love, too, about that story in the book is that he vetoes the story 2 weeks in a row. The next week it happens. The third week it happens. And then a few weeks later he fires the guy who had the story because he didn't want the reminder around that he dropped the ball.
Yeah. He was not going to be. He's not going to have evidence of him being wrong. Yeah, I guess when you're a tyrant, that's one of the things that happens. You can do it.
Now, aside from the anthrax attacks, which I want to ask you about, I thought it would be interesting to ask if did 9/11 change anything, for the tabloid industry? I mean, obviously, people always say that the world changed on 9/11, but did you see any sort of change in?
No, not really. They were in decline already by 2001. They were still struggling along, but it was a decline, declining circulations. No, I can't think that their focus is more to Hollywood than to civil affairs. Than to New York like that.
Now, talk a little bit about that anthrax attack, though, because that was stunning when I read that in the book. That the building was shut down for 6 years, the headquarters, and that the photo library of 5 million photos was deemed contaminated and had to be destroyed. And some of these are like priceless photos.
Absolutely were. Elvis, the last picture of Elvis that on the cover. I have one of those things. I can't remember what year the attack was. It had to be about 95, 96. But anyway, it was early on, and it was early in the use of CDs to store images, and they'd start, instead of having negatives. I mean, some of my pictures were in there that went. I mean, my baffling chair of death pictures went. They were in there, but nobody could use them because they could be contaminated.
Yeah.
And so everything was destroyed. 5 or 6 million images. But the only thing that they saved out of it was a jukebox full of CDs of images. That was a primitive storage that they'd had. That was just the beginning of CDs, putting your photo on a CD, not even a DVD. But everything, all the other things went. The celebrities, the news stories, the ghost stories. Everything you think of a library, a photo library, absolutely priceless.
Yeah.
In its way.
That's just stunning. It makes you wonder, really, what was behind all that. Because I'm sure there was people and organizations that have been happy to have had that library destroyed in some ways.
Do you know, wasn't there just last week, didn't Ted Kaczynski get somehow involved in this? Weren't they looking at his involvement, his possible involvement in more attacks?
I know he was being looked at for the 82 Tylenol thing.
That's right, it was Tylenol, that's right. There was a DOD guy who was attacking the popular media, and I guess it would get you a lot of attention, if you attack the most prominent source of popular culture, however liked or disliked it is.
Yeah.
I guess being outstanding in your field in any way is going to be once you pop your head above the level of the trench, you're going to get it shot at, whether it's the New York Times or the National Enquirer.
Now, I got to ask you about what my favorites. Like I said, I was born in '79, so my formative years were sort of like the late '80s and the '90s. So I have a sort of special place in my heart for Weekly World News.
Oh, God love them. I love the wacky. Yeah.
How did that whole
World
thing?
News.
How did that come up? I mean, how did that even? Because they by the time I was old enough to read the tabloids, it seemed like National Enquirer had sort of shaken off a lot of the paranormal, and a lot of that stuff sort of had shifted over to Weekly World News.
Yeah, what happened was the Enquirer went to printing in color in about probably 80, maybe it was as early as it had to be 77 or something like that. Anyway, but then they had the old printing presses in Pompano Beach in Florida, and the Weekly World News looked just the way the old Enquirer used to look, in black and white.
Okay.
So Gene Pope had these printing presses and nothing to do, you see. So he said, well, let's run a magazine, let's run a paper, a book off that. And that was the birth of the Weekly World News. And the Wacky never had a staff of more than about 6 people. And these guys decided that they had a room full of experts, so there's no need to go out and bother other people with interviews and things. They could just do their own. So they'd find a story and embellish it and put it in there. And pretty soon they were selling about 1 million copies a week, mostly to college kids.
Yeah.
Because they were good inventive stories, and they'd do these really crude Photoshop type things. Hillary Clinton marrying an alien or whatever. Wonderful stuff. They actually used one of my predictions. I used to do a prediction. I didn't personally do the predictions, but I would put together the annual and biannual psychic predictions issues. We'd get a dozen psychics to. Well, the psychics would always want to predict, that a famous person will die. And we wanted them to predict something like, Doris Day's thighs will be eaten by a pack of wild dogs. So we had to kind of meet somewhere in the middle. And I actually, I spent some creative time putting together interesting predictions, which I then mentioned to the psychics, the commercial psychics who weren't psychic at all. And they'd agree to them, and they'd get their few $100, and the publicity. And one of them that I put together, the Weekly World News did me the honor of running as a story, and the prediction was that the Saudis would tow an iceberg from the Arctic to Saudi Arabia as a source of fresh water. They'd have a terrible time getting it through the Straits of Gibraltar, because they're only 8 miles wide. Yeah. So it was a pretty big iceberg. And they get it ashore, and when it melted, inside they'd find the remains of an alien space expedition to Earth, which I thought was a good prediction. Chances a bit remote of it coming true, but it was a good prediction. So, of course, the Weekly World News ran this as a story that the Saudis had done this and then hushed it up, and that Saudi aeronautical engineers were reverse engineering the UFO to find out how it worked. I understand that when they broke into it, they found a crystal altar inside with a picture of Tim Binnell.
Now, You had left the Inquirer before Pope died. What was the mood like, sort of, when all that went down? Because, I mean, this guy was like a titan of the industry. So, what were people saying? What was it like? Times have changed.
The editor, who was Pope's henchman, immediately made a bid for power. And when Pope's widow said, "I want his desk, taken out of his office," he said, "No, the desk is a symbol of his power, and I want to keep it." And between this and that and various other things that went on between the editor and the widow, they put the editor's picture up in the lobby of the Inquirer with a note saying, "This man is not to be allowed on the premises. Security to throw him off if he comes in."
Oh, wow.
But he called the staff together. I mean, I wasn't there because I was on the West Coast now. And he called the staff together and said, "This place is no longer a rich man's toy. And you're all going to have to buckle down, and you're not going to be paid very much. You're going to have to work a lot harder." That was the gist of the inspiring speech. And they sold the paper off for $418 million, I think it was.
Wow.
Mrs. Pope, the widow, went to Rome on a 6-month shopping spree. And a couple of asset strippers came in, stripped out everything they could, things like the distribution company, and ran the paper for about a year, living off inventory without ordering new stories in.
Oh, wow.
And then they were able to sort of show these books that showed that their editorial costs, they fired a couple of hundred people. They showed that their editorial costs were really low because they'd been living off their accumulated fat. And they went public with it. And they launched it at something like $16 a share. So half a dozen people got very rich, and all those shareholders are presently holding some damn worthless paper that's, worth pennies. It was a classic asset stripping operation, I'd say.
It's very disappointing. Just the stories from when you were there in the 70s are just,
Yeah, and it wasn't just me. I mean, you've got to think there were 80 of us, some of us, all out every week doing these stories, doing different stories. One of my colleagues went down to, Mexico City when the gas lines erupted and the streets were falling in, and he's there, he's on the next plane down there and sending back reports that you'd now be seeing, on national television here. Well, probably not here because it's Mexico. They, if it's not here in the States, people tend not to be as interested.
Yeah.
But no, we covered things. If it was Princess Caroline's wedding, I was on that one. In Monaco, we had a whole team went out there. I went to the UK for the first test tube baby. Oh, if here's it's not a plug, it's a bit of joy for your listeners. Go to the website, go to bannisterbooks.com, and look up Joe Mullin's report. Joe was with me on that, and he became the Laura Brown correspondent. The test tube baby, the first test tube baby.
Yeah.
And he tells a beautiful story of how he nearly killed the test tube baby.
Oh yeah.
When she was choking to death. Yeah.
Yeah, just, reading the book, I just kept thinking to myself, I was born in the wrong time. I wish I could have been there in those days, because it just sounds like, you're chasing the stories, they send you on a drop of a hat to just go after the craziest stuff.
It was a magical thing, yeah. It was an echo of the British newspaper scene, after World War II, up until the 60s and 70s, when it was a similar thing. There's an element of piracy, there's an element of adventure, there's a lot of fun involved, and there's some talented people doing some hard work. But at the end of it all, you got the reward, you saw the stuff, and people enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It'll happen again in a different way. It'll happen, we're now moving, of course, to the mass media's moving to, into electronic media.
Yeah. Well, it seems like all print media is in bad shape now anyway, so.
Well, what's happening now, of course, is that anybody with a cell phone can be a reporter.
Right.
But what you read, you can't trust anymore because you don't know what that person's training or inclination is. So, when Sarah Palin's telling us, what Paul Revere really was telling people, that he was saying that he was warning the British that the British were coming. I'm going, well, this is symptomatic of anybody can be a reporter. It's not accurate, but anybody can do it. So I guess the pendulum will come back. We'll come back to accuracy, and we'll see some, electronic version of the New York Times or whatever. Yeah. That people can trust.
Well, just one last sort of aspect of the tabloids that I thought was interesting from the book too was the story that always gets me every time I'm in the supermarket. I always sort of like have to read the article. It's these like last days articles.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Just stunning, and there's always it's like every other week it's someone on their deathbed.
It's the same person usually. Have you noticed? It's usually Doris Day. Poor old girl. She must have died 15 times, or been on the verge of it 15 times. In fact, actually, I've personally done at least 4 last days of Doris Day. The last of Doris. I think she'll outlive us all. God love the girl. Yeah, they like that. They like to. It's the Germans call it Schadenfreude, don't they? It's taking pleasure in other people's discomfort, and so they like to show these pictures of people who've actually, whether it's Elizabeth Taylor, well, she's finally gone, but somebody who's had it all and is now suffering through the end. This ghastly fascination.
Yeah, it's very morose, like I said, and then you don't realize some of these, they're just people without their makeup on or they're aged, so you don't really, but you're in the checkout aisle and you look and you're like, oh my God, she's gonna die like any day now. So they always get me though. So I was happy to read in the book that that this is commonplace that
right. Any picture of Clint Eastwood these days is gonna look like his last days, and he's hale and hearty. So just got a few wrinkles.
Oh, man.
Oh, dear. It's a patina of living, I guess.
I guess so. Now, as I said, I can't put this book over enough, and I'll put it over a few more times here as we close the book, no pun intended, on this conversation. But, what's next for Paul Bannister? I presume you're still doing some freelance work, because some of the stories in the book were pretty recent. So, what have you been up to since the book came out, aside from, obviously, the press tour and stuff? What do you have cooking here for the future?
Well, yeah, in self-defense, I've moved away from the tabloids. I've had to do that because there's no income there. But I wrote this book. I've just written another one, which is nothing like it's a historical novel. It's based on a true story. There's a sample of that actually, Carausius, on my website. There's a little bit of it there. So if you look at bannisterbooks.com, you can actually read the next one. But I might, I don't know. There's a lot more material from the days of the tabloids that might work, and there's a lot more material, frankly, from my psychic work that I could turn into a book. So who knows? Maybe I'll become a correspondent for Binnall of America.
I would absolutely be honored. I would love that.
I'm teasing you, Tim.
Oh, now you hurt my feelings.
Doesn't come up to your standards, I'm sure.
No, we don't pay, so.
That's what I mean.
So we're at a push, I guess. Paul, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. And folks, if you think we gave away the book here, you're sadly mistaken. We didn't even get into a ton of stuff that's in there. I purposely didn't even bring up the whole Richard Simmons story. So you got to pick up the book just for that. And we have Paul to blame for possibly for Dwayne Dog Chapman's rise to fame.
Oh yeah.
We've got a scoop in the book about Oprah Winfrey's funeral plans.
Yeah,
there's
true,
a whole bunch of amazing survival stories from people who had literal near-death experiences that are just stunning, and a whole bunch of celebrity stories and paranormal stories that we just didn't get into here because I want folks to go out and get this book. Trust me, my friends, do yourself a favor. Go out and pick up Tabloid Man. It is absolutely amazing. You are going to love this book because I was just thrilled by it and captivated by it. And much like this conversation, it was a lot of fun. Paul, I can't thank you enough, and I really hope we can do this again sometime.
It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, Tim, and to be on the show. I'm pink with embarrassment, and anytime at all for you, my friend.
Thank you very much, sir. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
That does it for this installment of BoA Audio Season 6. Big thanks, of course, to Paul Bannister for coming on the show. Be sure to check out his website, www.bannisterbooks.com. You spell that BANNISTER BoA.books.com for more information on Tabloid Man and the Baffling Chair of Death, as well as other works from Paul Bannister. Moving right along now, it's been way too long since we dove into the BoA Audio listener feedback mailbag, but we're going to do it right now and highlight a couple of emails from the BoA Audio listeners and also take care of some in-house notes. The first one here comes from Ben, no hometown listed, and here's what he has to say. Thank you for all of your work on BoA. I've listened to every episode and continue to be enthralled. Great guests, and your interview style is reminiscent of early 90s Art Bell, in the way you'll let the guests say their part, no matter how insane. I've noticed an issue with your iTunes downloads. They stopped adding new episodes over a month ago, and I was wondering if you had any info on that. Hopefully the newer shows will be added soon, but I feel like I'm missing out. Thank you for your time and your work, Ben. There you go. That's the perfect segue into the in-house notes. First of all, thank you for writing in, Ben. Thank you for your kind words. I really appreciate that. Art Bell is certainly a hero of mine, and to have my style compared to his is truly humbling. I definitely like to let the guests have the floor when they're on the program and say what they want to say without interruption or overt skepticism. I let the audience decide what they want to believe, and I let them do their own research into the matter. Now, with regards to the iTunes downloads and the whole issue surrounding the BoA Audio Archive and the big project, moving it over to Cyber Ears. Well, we had a little bump in the road because I had to take a little time away from BoA to attend my brother's wedding and all the festivities surrounding that. But prior to that, we completed the major part of the project, which was transferring all of the MP3 archive over to cyberears.com. So, as it stands right now, the complete BoA Audio archive has been moved over to CyberEars. Now it's just a matter of me sitting down and fixing the iTunes feed and adjusting all of the links at BoA. I'm hoping and thinking and really, really optimistic that by the time folks are listening to this, the iTunes feed will be fixed, and I'm going to sit down and just start fixing all of the links on all of the pages for previous BoA Audio episodes. I'm hoping that's not going to take too long. I'm well aware that it's certainly going to take a few hours at least, but it has to be done. It's something that has been really weighing us down for the last few months and has been a huge thorn in my side. Believe me, if you could see the emails I get from people day after day, week after week, now month after month, asking what's going on with the iTunes feed, what's going on with the audio archive at BoA, I've just been inundated with those emails. Thank you to all the folks who have been emailing me about that. Your voices have been heard. I'm well aware of the situation, and we are nearly out of the woods. So there's the update on that. Hopefully, by the time you hear from me on the next edition of BoA Audio, there'll be no more talk about the big audio transfer project because it will have been totally completed. The next email here comes from Jim, no hometown listed. Here's what he has to say. Please investigate the mysterious creature Mothman of Humboldt County, California. These creatures appear after rainstorms and on hot sunny days, are seen at night around dumpsters, and make strange sounds, and look basically like zombies. Besides, we could use the tourist trade. Jim. I've never even heard of this. I'm not sure if this is like a joke about meth addicts or if it's an actual creature that people have seen in Humboldt County. I'm going to have to look more into this, but maybe other people out there have heard of this thing, Mothman of Humboldt County. Again, I'm skeptical. I think it's some kind of joke, but I will look into it, and thank you for the suggestion, Jim. And with that, we will close the BoA Audio listener feedback mailbag kind of early here this week because we are already about a week behind on where I wanted to be on getting this episode out to folks. So I want to hurry up and do that. And the sooner I can get the episode up, the sooner I can turn my attention towards wrapping up this audio project. For all the folks out there who want to get in touch with me for future installments of BoA Audio listener feedback, here's how you can do it. Simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com or go to binallofamerica.com, BINNALL of America.com, and click the contact button, or head on over to the official BoA forum, theusofe.com, theusofe.com. That is, of course, BoA's Paranormal Playground, the official Binall of America forum. Lots of discussion going on there regarding the paranormal and pop culture at the US of E. And, of course, I'm available on Twitter and Facebook, so look me up on there under the name Binall. Follow me, befriend me, poke me, it's all good, and we'd love to have you as part of BoA's online circle of friends. Up next, let's take a moment and thank the outstanding and esteemed BoA staff: Leslie, Chiron, Regan Lee, Joe V, Tina Senna, Rochelle Hawks, Richard Thomas, Marla Pena, Bruce Pretty, Tony Morrill, our contributing cartoonist Andy Carolyn, and our webmaster Jeremy Boston. Since the last time you heard from me, we got a couple of new columns at the website. One from Regan Lee discussing the strange relationship between humans and lobsters, and Leslie talks about the wildfires raging into New Mexico in the latest installment of Gray Matters. We got an all-new Richard's Room 101 lined up for later this week, as well as new stuff from Bruce Pretty and Tony Morrill and Tina Senna. So lots of great columns in the till from the BoA staff. But I also want to take a moment here and offer congratulations to two members of the BoA staff. First of all, our webmaster Jeremy Boston, now the proud father of a baby boy. Congratulations to my good buddy Jeremy Boston. And I want to congratulate former BoA staff writer A.M. Murphy, who is also the mother of a new baby boy as well. So, two new BoA babies out there in the last few weeks, and the second generation of Binall of America continues to grow thanks to Jeremy Boston and A.M. Murphy. I want to congratulate both of them once again, wish them the very best of luck, and welcome their children into the world. We say it week in and week out, folks. If you're only listening to BoA audio and you're not reading the columns at Binall of America, then you're only getting half of the story. BoA, make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. Now comes the part of the program where we take off the hat and pass it around to the audience and ask you to help us out and make a donation to Binall of America. You can do that simply by going to BoA and clicking the PayPal button. That's right there on the homepage, as well as the BoA audio archive. But if you don't want to do an online donation, you can send us a snail mail donation to our P.O. Box. You can find that at Tim Binnall, Binnall, P.O. Box 232, Pinehurst, Mass. 01866. And once again, that's P.O. Box 232, Pinehurst, Pinehurst, Mass. 01866. And if you're going to send us a donation via snail mail, please make it payable to Tim Binnall and not to Binall of America, because my bank will not cash those checks, and then I have to get back in touch with you, and we have to go through the whole process all over again. As we have been saying year after year at the end of the program, no donation is too small, and all donations go towards Binall of America and BoA Audio to help keep the website and the audio series up and running, freely available, and commercial-free for all of our great readers and listeners the world over. Let me throw in another plug here at the end of the show. We talked about it on the last edition of the program, but I want to mention it once again here now, and that is, of course, the third annual Exeter UFO Festival, September 3rd in Exeter, New Hampshire. Stanton Friedman, Richard Dolan, Kathleen Martin, and, of course, myself as the MC for the big event. It is a fun, informative, and free festival for the whole family. Tons of stuff going on there for the Exeter UFO Festival. As I said, it's totally free. If you can make the trip up to Exeter, New Hampshire, you definitely want to go out of your way to do that. It is a blast every year. I like to call it the paranormal party of the year because it is huge. We had so much fun last year, and it's only going to be bigger and better this year. You can find out more about the big event at ExeterUFOFestival.com or click on the banner at BoA. Next week on the program, I'm kind of debating who will be the next guest on the program. We've got about 5 episodes in the can right now. I could take my pick. I'd originally hoped to do Spontaneous Human Combustion for July 4th weekend, but this episode's already kind of coming out here on July 4th weekend, so we're a little bit behind the times, if you will. And it's a very good chance that the next installment of BoA Audio will be coming at you around this time next week, well past July 4th. So we're going to bump Spontaneous Human Combustion up another week or so and bring in one of our old friends on the program here for the next installment of the show. So the guest next week on the program will be our old buddy Peter Robbins, making his return to BoA Audio. We're going to have a UFO jam session, pretty much threw the questions out the window, because I've talked to Peter on countless occasions about a whole bunch of different stuff in the world of ufology, and I want to get his take on UFO studies, where ufology seems to be right now, and where it needs to go in the future. So it is certainly an enlightening conversation. It is a lot of laughs, a lot of fun, and it is quite the enjoyable UFO jam session with the incomparable Peter Robbins. That'll be next week on the program. In 2 weeks, Spontaneous Human Combustion. So stay tuned for that at BoA as well. Plus, we've got tons and tons more fantastic episodes lined up for you. As I said, we've been taping a slew of shows this month, and I think people are going to really dig them because there are some wild installments of the program lined up for you in that mix. And with that said, we'll close the book on this edition of BoA Audio. Big thanks once again to Paul Bannister for coming on the show. Check out BannisterBooks.com, and definitely, folks, get your hands on Tabloid Man and the Baffling Chair of Death. You will not be disappointed. Also want to thank Ben and Jim for contributing to BoA Audio listener feedback this week. And, of course, I want to thank all of the great BoA Audio listeners out there tuning in right now at the end of the program, the hardcore BoA Audio listeners, the folks who have been with us through thick and thin over the years. You guys are awesome. This program would not be what it is without you. Trust me, I know that better than anybody in the whole wide world, and I'm just truly humbled by your unending support of this program. Thank you for making BoA Audio a part of your esoteric audio playlist. Until next time, this is Tim Binnall, thanking you for listening and signing off.